Picture this, you're 7 months pregnant, and you catch your husband burning documents with his business partner at 2 a.m. When you ask what's happening, he looks you dead in the eye and says, "You weren't supposed to see this. Now we have a problem." By morning, you've been declared mentally incompetent. Your bank accounts are frozen. Your doctor is prescribing mystery pills. And the woman you thought was your friend, she's wearing your clothes and sleeping in your bed. But here's what they didn't count on. You're not as helpless as they think you are. This is the true story of Sarah Mitchell. And what happened next will shock you. If you think you can predict how this ends, think again. Hit that like button if you're ready for a story that will make you question everyone you trust. And don't forget to subscribe, because stories like this one will change how you see the world forever. Stay until the end. The twist involving her billionaire father will blow your mind. Sarah Mitchell's bare feet touched the cold hardwood floor as she padded toward the kitchen at 2 in the morning. 7 months pregnant and plagued by insomnia, she had grown accustomed to these midnight wanderings through their Boston penthouse. The baby kicked restlessly against her ribs as she reached for a glass of water. That's when she heard the voices. Her husband Jake's familiar baritone drifted from his home office, accompanied by a woman's laughter. Alexandra Reed, his business partner. Sarah frowned. Why would they be working this late? She moved closer to the partially open door, her pregnancy making her steps clumsy. Through the crack, she could see Jake hunched over his laptop, his usually perfect hair disheveled. Alex stood beside him, her red blazer unbuttoned, revealing a black lace camisole underneath. But they weren't in a romantic embrace. They were burning documents. Jake held a stack of papers over a metal wastebasket while Alex lit them with a silver lighter. The flames cast dancing shadows across their faces as cryptocurrency transfer screens glowed on multiple monitors. "The offshore accounts are clean," Alex said, her voice cold and businesslike. "No traces back to the Mitchell Trust Fund." Sarah's breath caught. Her trust fund, the inheritance from her grandmother that she had never touched. Keeping it separate from their joint finances, Jake looked up from the burning papers, his eyes meeting Alex's with an intensity Sarah had never seen him direct at her. "Good. Phase 2 starts tomorrow. The medical documentation should be enough." "And if she fights it?" Alex asked. Jake's laugh was cruel, unfamiliar. "She's 7 months pregnant and hasn't spoken to her family in 3 years. Who's going to believe her over us?" Sarah pressed closer to the door, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain they would hear it. The baby seemed to sense her distress, kicking harder. That's when Jake looked up and saw her. His expression didn't change to guilt or surprise. Instead, his features hardened into something she had never seen before. Cold calculation. "Sarah?" His voice was steady, almost bored. "You weren't supposed to see this." She stepped into the room, her hands instinctively protective over her belly. "Jake, what's going on? What are you burning?" Alex turned slowly, a small smile playing at her lips. She made no move to button her blazer. If anything, she seemed amused by Sarah's appearance. "We have a problem now," Jake said to Alex, as if Sarah weren't standing right there. "Jake, you're scaring me." Sarah's voice came out smaller than she intended. "What medical documentation? What's this about my trust fund?" He stood up, his 6-foot frame towering over her. For the first time in their 3-year marriage, Sarah felt physically intimidated by him. "You should go back to bed, honey," he said, but there was no warmth in the endearment. "This is business. You wouldn't understand. Business that involves burning papers at 2 a.m. Sarah's voice cracked. "Business that involves my inheritance." Alex stepped forward, her heels clicking on the hardwood. "Sarah, you look tired. All this stress can't be good for the baby." There was something in the way she said it, not concern, but almost a threat. Sarah looked between them, these two people she trusted most in the world, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October night. "I think I deserve an explanation," Sarah said, trying to inject authority into her voice. "These are my finances you're discussing." Jake exchanged a look with Alex. Some silent communication passed between them. "You're right," Jake said finally. "You do deserve an explanation, but not tonight. Go to bed, Sarah. We'll talk in the morning." It wasn't a request. Sarah stood there for another moment, looking at the man she had married, the woman she had considered a friend. The burning documents had reduced to ash, but the smell of smoke lingered in the air like an omen. "Fine," Sarah whispered, "but we are talking tomorrow." As she turned to leave, she heard Alex's voice behind her, low and amused. "Sweet dreams, Sarah." Back in their bedroom, Sarah lay awake until dawn, the baby restless inside her. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Jake's cold stare and Alex's satisfied smile. She tried to convince herself she had misunderstood, that there was an innocent explanation for what she had witnessed. But deep in her bones, she knew her life had just changed forever. Sarah woke to an empty bed and the smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen. For a moment, she allowed herself to hope that the previous night had been some kind of stress-induced nightmare. Then she saw Jake's side of the bed, unslept in. She found him at the kitchen island, fully dressed in his charcoal business suit, scrolling through his phone with mechanical precision. No acknowledgement of her entrance, no good morning kiss, no concern for how she had slept. Jake. She poured herself a glass of orange juice, her hands trembling slightly. "About last night. Sarah, we need to discuss something important." His tone was clinical, detached. He didn't look up from his phone. "I've been consulting with some specialists about your behavior lately." "My behavior?" The words came out as a whisper. The mood swings, the paranoia, the accusations. He finally looked at her, but his eyes were those of a stranger. "Pregnancy can cause severe psychological instability. I'm concerned about your mental state." Sarah set down her glass so hard that orange juice splashed across the marble countertop. "Psychological instability." "Jake, what are you talking about? I haven't made any accusations." "Last night, you accused me of stealing from you." His voice remained calm, reasonable. "You seemed confused, almost delusional." "I didn't accuse you of anything. I asked for an explanation about what I saw, what you thought you saw." He stood up, straightening his tie with practiced movements. "Dr. Hayes agrees that your condition requires immediate intervention." The room seemed to tilt. "Dr. Hayes, my obstetrician." "When did you speak to him?" Jake pulled a manila folder from his briefcase and slid it across the island toward her. "These are the forms I filed yesterday with the probate court for your own protection and the safety of our child." Sarah's fingers shook as she opened the folder. Legal documents swam before her eyes, but certain phrases jumped out with brutal clarity: temporary mental incompetency, pregnancy-induced psychosis, financial decision-making compromised. "You had me declared mentally incompetent." The words came out as a choke. "Temporarily," Jake said, as if this distinction mattered. "Until after the birth and your recovery. I'm now your legal guardian for all financial and medical decisions." Sarah sank onto the bar stool, the papers fluttering to the floor. "You can't do this. You can't just—" Her phone buzzed with a text notification. "Bank of America. Your account access has been temporarily suspended. Please contact your legal representative. Then another, Chase credit, card services discontinued per legal request. And another, from her investment firm, per court order, account access transferred to legal guardian J. Collins. No, Sarah breathed, frantically scrolling through message after message. Every financial account, every credit card, every piece of her economic independence, gone. It's for your own good, Jake said, buttoning his jacket. Pregnant women make poor financial decisions. The hormones cloud judgment. Jake, please. She looked up at him, tears blurring her vision. This is insane. I'm not mentally ill. I'm pregnant, not psychotic. That's exactly what someone with pregnancy-induced psychosis would say. He picked up his briefcase. Dr. Hayes wants to see you at 11 today. Alex will drive you. Alex? Sarah wiped her eyes. Why Alex? She's your emergency contact now. For medical situations. Jake headed toward the door. I thought it would be better to have a woman involved, given your condition. My condition is being pregnant. Sarah's voice broke. Not insane. Jake paused at the door, his hand on the handle. For just a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of the man she had married, some hint of guilt or regret. But when he turned back, his eyes were cold again. Sarah, the sooner you accept help, the sooner we can move past this. Fight it, and things will only get worse. The door closed with a soft click, leaving Sarah alone in their kitchen, surrounded by legal documents that had stripped away her identity in a single morning. She tried calling her bank, but they wouldn't speak to her without authorization from her legal guardian. She tried her credit card company, her investment firm, even her gynecologist's office. The same response everywhere. By 10:30, when Alex arrived to drive her to the doctor's appointment, Sarah was shaking with more than pregnancy hormones. She was experiencing something she had never felt before in her privileged life, complete powerlessness. Ready to go, sweetie? Alex asked, her voice dripping with false concern. She looked immaculate as always, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her makeup flawless. Sarah stared at her through the peephole. This woman who had been in her home just hours ago, burning documents and planning her downfall, now stood in her hallway wearing the mask of a caring friend. She had no choice but to open the door. Sarah's fingers trembled as she dialed her father's number. 3 years of silence stretched between them. 3 years since she had walked away from Mitchell Oil and Gas to marry Jake against William Mitchell's explicit wishes. But now, sitting in the parking lot outside Dr. Hayes' office with Alex watching her every move, Sarah had nowhere else to turn. The phone rang twice before his familiar gravelly voice answered. Sarah, Daddy. The word came out broken, childlike. She hadn't called him that since she was 12. Where are you? Are you safe? William Mitchell might be ruthless in business, but Sarah could hear genuine concern in his voice. I need help. Sarah glanced toward the medical building where Alex was waiting for her. Jake had me declared mentally incompetent. He's taken control of everything, my accounts, my medical decisions, even my trust fund from grandmother. The silence stretched so long that Sarah thought the call had dropped. Then William's voice returned, low and dangerous. That son of a bitch! Daddy, I know we haven't spoken, but you're my daughter. His voice was steel. That matters more than any argument we've had. Where are you right now? Sarah explained about the forced doctor's appointment, about Alex's new role as her emergency contact, about the legal documents that had stripped away her autonomy overnight. Don't sign anything, William commanded. Don't agree to any treatments or medications. I'm calling Harrison immediately." James Harrison was the family's senior attorney, a man who had never lost a case that mattered to the Mitchell family interests. "Can he really do this to me?" Sarah asked. "Not for long." William's confidence was absolute. "Jake Collins picked the wrong family to con. By tomorrow morning, I'll have those court orders overturned and his company's finances under a microscope. If he's been stealing from you, we'll bury him so deep he'll never see daylight." For the first time in 24 hours, Sarah felt like she could breathe. This was what she had forgotten during their estrangement: the sheer power of being a Mitchell. Her father controlled oil refineries across Texas and Oklahoma, had senators on speed dial, and could make corporate executives disappear with a single phone call. "I'm scared," she admitted. "You don't need to be scared anymore," William said firmly. "You're under my protection now. Come home tonight. I'll send security to escort you." "What about Jake?" "Let me worry about Jake Collins." There was something predatory in William's tone. "By the time I'm finished with him, he'll be begging to sign divorce papers." Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the baby kick against her ribs, a reminder of the innocent life caught in this nightmare. "Thank you, Daddy." "I should have fought harder when you married him," William said quietly. "I knew he was wrong for you. You were protecting me then too," Sarah realized. "I just couldn't see it. Tonight, we'll plan his destruction together." After hanging up, Sarah walked into the medical building with renewed confidence. Let Alex play her games, and Dr. Hayes ask his leading questions. Let Jake think he had won. The Mitchell family had been building and destroying empires for 4 generations, and Sarah was about to remember exactly what that meant. The appointment was exactly as invasive as she had expected. Dr. Hayes asked probing questions about her mental state, her relationship with reality, her ability to make sound decisions. Alex sat in the corner, occasionally interjecting helpful observations about Sarah's recent erratic behavior. But Sarah no longer cared. Each condescending question, each manipulation, only fueled her determination. These people had no idea what they had awakened. "Mrs. Collins," Dr. Hayes said finally, "I'm recommending a mild sedative to help with your anxiety. The stress isn't good for the baby." "No medications," Sarah said firmly. "I'm not taking anything that might affect my pregnancy." Dr. Hayes exchanged a look with Alex. "Mrs. Collins, in your current state, I'm not certain you're capable of making medical decisions that are in your best interest. My father's attorney will be reviewing all medical recommendations," Sarah said calmly. "William Mitchell doesn't take chances with his grandchild's health." The effect was immediate. Dr. Hayes went pale, and Alex's confident smirk faltered. Everyone in Boston knew the Mitchell name. Of course," Dr. Hayes stammered. "We want what's best for both you and the baby." "Then we understand each other," Sarah said, standing up. "Alex, I'll find my own way home." She walked out of the office with her head high, leaving both of them staring after her. Tonight, she would sleep in her childhood bedroom in the Mitchell estate. Tomorrow, the war would begin. And this time, Sarah would have the most powerful man in the energy sector fighting alongside her. The Mitchell estate looked exactly as Sarah remembered. Imposing iron gates, a circular drive lined with ancient oaks, and the sprawling Georgian mansion that had housed 4 generations of oil money. As the security car pulled up to the front steps, she felt like she was coming home from a battle she had never chosen to fight. William Mitchell stood waiting in the doorway, his silver hair perfectly styled despite the late hour, his presence commanding even in casual clothes. At 68, he remained a formidable figure, the kind of man who could make grown executives weep with a single phone call. Sarah. He embraced her carefully, mindful of her pregnancy. Welcome home. The grand foyer smelled of the same expensive furniture polish and fresh flowers that had defined her childhood. Nothing had changed. The marble floors, the crystal chandelier, the portrait of her great-grandfather who had founded Mitchell Oil. I've had Harrison working on the legal issues since we spoke, William said, guiding her into his study. The preliminary injunctions are already filed. By morning, your accounts will be unfrozen. Sarah sank into the leather chair across from his desk, the same chair where she had sat as a child when summoned for important conversations. How is this possible? How can Jake just declare me mentally incompetent? William poured himself a scotch and offered her sparkling water. Emergency psychological holds are easier to obtain than people realize, especially for pregnant women. A complicit doctor, a concerned spouse, some carefully worded testimony about erratic behavior. But it's all lies. Truth is often irrelevant in family court. William sat behind his desk, his fingers steepled. What matters is narrative, and Jake constructed a compelling one. Sarah took a sip of water, trying to calm her racing heart. Thank you for believing me. William's expression grew distant. Sarah, there's something I need to tell you about Jake Collins. Something in his tone made her look up sharply. What do you mean? I had him investigated when you first started dating. William opened a file drawer and pulled out a thick folder. Standard procedure for anyone getting close to family. Daddy, I don't want to hear about his past relationships or... He's been on my payroll for 4 years. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She set down her water glass with shaking hands. What did you say? William opened the folder and spread documents across his desk. Bank records, wire transfers, employment contracts. I've been funding his company through shell corporations since 2018. The marriage wasn't a coincidence. Sarah, it was a business arrangement. Sarah stared at the papers, her vision blurring. No, that's not possible. Jake Collins was hired to get close to you, marry you, and neutralize you as a threat to the family business. William's voice was matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing quarterly earnings. A threat? Sarah's voice came out as a whisper. I walked away from the company. I wanted nothing to do with Mitchell Oil. You're my only heir, William said simply. Eventually, you would have inherited controlling interest. That would have been problematic. Problematic for who? William looked genuinely surprised by the question. For the business, Sarah, you've always been too soft, too emotional. You would have run the company into the ground within 5 years. Sarah felt something die inside her chest, not just her marriage, but her entire understanding of her life, her choices, her identity. So you hired someone to marry me. I hired someone to manage you. William's tone suggested this was a reasonable solution. Keep you happy, keep you distracted, keep you away from corporate decisions. And the pregnancy, an unexpected complication, but not insurmountable. William pulled out another document. Jake was supposed to maintain the arrangement indefinitely. The fact that he's trying to take direct control of your assets suggests he's gotten greedy. Sarah stood up slowly, her hands protectively over her belly. You're talking about my husband, the father of my child. I'm talking about an employee who has exceeded his authority. William's eyes were cold. Jake Collins forgot who he works for. He works for you. The reality was settling in like poison. My marriage is a business transaction. My husband is your employee. My pregnancy is a complication. Sarah, you're being dramatic. Get out. The words came from some deep place inside her, some last reserve of strength. Both of you, Jake and you're the same person. William stood up, his expression hardening. Sarah, you're upset, but you need to think clearly. Without my protection, Jake will destroy you completely. Without your interference, I would never have met Jake in the first place. Sarah's voice broke. You orchestrated my entire adult life. I protected you from making foolish choices. You made me a prisoner. She was crying now, angry tears that felt like acid. At least Jake's betrayal makes sense. He's a con artist. But you're supposed to be my father. William moved around the desk toward her. Sarah, calm down. This stress isn't good for the baby. Don't you dare pretend to care about this baby. Sarah backed toward the door. This child is just another complication for you to manage. Where are you going? William demanded. You can't survive on your own. Your accounts are frozen. Your credit is destroyed. And Jake has legal guardianship. You need me. Sarah reached for the door handle. I'll figure it out. There's nowhere to go. William's mask of paternal concern finally slipped, revealing the ruthless businessman underneath. I control your trust fund. Jake controls your joint assets, and you have no independent income. Be reasonable, Sarah. She paused at the door, looking back at the man who had raised her. Reasonable would have been letting me live my own life. Your life would have been a disaster without my guidance. My life is a disaster because of your guidance. Sarah opened the door. At least now I know who my real enemies are. She walked out into the October night, 7 months pregnant and truly alone for the first time in her life. Behind her, she could hear William calling her name, but she didn't look back. The marriage had been fake. The father had been manipulative. And somewhere in Boston, Jake and Alex were probably planning the next phase of their scheme, but Sarah was done being anyone's victim. Sarah spent the night in a downtown hotel, paying cash and using her maiden name. The small room felt both terrifying and liberating, the first space in years that belonged entirely to her. She sat by the window, watching the city lights blur through her tears, feeling the baby's restless movements as if it too sensed the chaos surrounding them. By morning, she had made a decision. If both Jake and her father saw her as an asset to be managed, she would prove them wrong. She would reclaim her life, starting with her medical care. Dr. Marcus Hayes had been her obstetrician for 6 months. She had chosen him because he seemed kind, thorough, and genuinely interested in her well-being. Now she wondered how much of that concern had been performance. His office was in an upscale medical building in Back Bay, all glass and steel and expensive artwork. Sarah arrived early, determined to confront him about his conversation with Jake, about the recommendations he had made without consulting her. Mrs. Collins. The receptionist smiled brightly. You're early for your appointment. I don't have an appointment, Sarah said. I need to speak with Dr. Hayes immediately. I'm afraid he's with another patient. Tell him Sarah Mitchell is here. She used her father's name deliberately, watching the receptionist's expression change. Tell him it's urgent. Within 5 minutes, Dr. Hayes appeared in the waiting room, his usual warm smile replaced by nervous concern. Sarah, what a pleasant surprise. Come in, come in. In his office, surrounded by baby photos and medical diplomas, Sarah felt the last of her naivety crumble. This man she had trusted with her most vulnerable moments, who had seen her cry with joy at ultrasound appointments, who had held her hand during early complications, he had betrayed her as completely as everyone else. Dr. Hayes, Sarah said quietly, I want to see my complete medical file. Of course. But his hand hesitated over the filing cabinet. Sarah, is everything all right? Jake mentioned you've been under stress. When did you speak to Jake, Doctor? Hayes sat down behind his desk, no longer meeting her eyes. He called yesterday with some concerns about your mental state. As your husband, he has the right to discuss your care. And what did he tell you? That you've been experiencing mood swings, paranoid thoughts, accusations about financial impropriety. Dr. Hayes pulled out a prescription pad. These symptoms aren't uncommon in late pregnancy. I'd like to prescribe something mild to help with the anxiety. Sarah stared at the prescription he was writing. Those aren't vitamins. Are they, Doctor? Hayes looked up. Sarah, what do you mean? The supplements you prescribed last month, the ones that made me so tired I could barely function. Sarah's voice was steady, despite the fury building inside her. What were they really? Prenatal vitamins with additional... Don't lie to me. Sarah stood up. I want my medical records, and I want them now. Doctor... Hayes set down his pen. Sarah, I think you should sit down. You're becoming agitated, and that's not good for the baby. The baby. Sarah laughed bitterly. Everyone's so concerned about the baby. What about me? What about my right to know what medications I've been given? You signed consent forms. I signed forms for prenatal vitamins. Sarah's voice rose. If you've been giving me sedatives or mood stabilizers without my knowledge, that's medical malpractice at minimum. Dr. Hayes stood up, his demeanor shifting from concerned to defensive. Mrs. Collins, I think you need to speak with your husband before we continue this conversation. My husband doesn't get to make my medical decisions. Actually, given your current legal status... Dr. Hayes trailed off, realizing he had said too much. My current legal status... Sarah repeated the words slowly. You knew about the competency hearing before it happened. Dr. Hayes's silence was answer enough. You provided the medical evidence Jake needed. Sarah continued. You documented my supposed mental instability, my inability to make sound decisions. Sarah, please sit down. Your blood pressure. My blood pressure is fine. But even as she said it, Sarah could feel her heart racing, could feel the familiar tightness in her chest that had plagued her for weeks. Unless, what else have you been giving me? What other medications have you disguised as vitamins? Dr. Hayes moved toward her, his hands outstretched in a calming gesture. Sarah, you're having an anxiety attack. Let me help you. Don't touch me. Sarah backed toward the door. How much did he pay you? I beg your pardon. Jake, how much did he pay you to drug me, to document my deteriorating mental state, to provide medical justification for having me declared incompetent? Dr. Hayes's face went pale. Sarah, that's a very serious accusation. It's not an accusation. It's a fact, isn't it? Sarah felt strangely calm now, the pieces finally clicking into place. You've been chemically managing my mood for months, making me tired and confused, documenting my responses as symptoms of mental illness. The medications I prescribed were for your own good. There it is. Sarah reached for the door handle. You admit you prescribed medications I didn't consent to? Dr. Hayes lunged forward, grabbing her wrist. Sarah, you can't leave like this. In your condition, you could hurt yourself or the baby. Sarah looked down at his hand on her wrist, then back up at his face. In that moment, she saw him clearly for the first time, not the kind doctor who had cared for her pregnancy, but another conspirator in the systematic destruction of her autonomy. Let go of me, she said quietly. I'm calling Jake, Dr. Hayes said, reaching for his phone with his free hand. You need immediate psychiatric evaluation. Sarah jerked her wrist free and backed out of the office. You just admitted to drugging me without consent, and now you're trying to have me committed. I think we both know who needs evaluation. She walked quickly through the waiting room, ignoring Dr. Hayes calling her name, ignoring the stares of other patients. In the elevator, she finally allowed herself to shake. The medications explained everything: the exhaustion, the confusion, the difficulty concentrating that had made Jake's gaslighting so effective. Dr. Hayes had been chemically preparing her for institutional control, making her easier to manage, easier to manipulate. But now she knew, and knowing changed everything. As the elevator descended, Sarah felt something shift inside her, not just the baby moving, but something deeper. The fear was still there, but it was joined by something else now. Rage. Pure, clarifying rage. They had all underestimated her. Jake, her father, Dr. Hayes. They had seen a privileged woman who could be managed, controlled, discarded when convenient. They were about to discover how wrong they were. Sarah walked out of the medical building and straight into Detective Maria Rivera, who was waiting by the front entrance with 2 cups of coffee and an expression of grim determination. Mrs. Collins. Detective Rivera was a compact woman in her early 40s, with intelligent dark eyes and the kind of presence that commanded attention without demanding it. I've been trying to reach you. Sarah hesitated. After Dr. Hayes's betrayal, she wasn't sure she could trust anyone in an official capacity. How did you know I was here? I've been investigating your husband's company for financial fraud, Rivera said simply. Your name came up in several concerning contexts. I thought we should talk. My name, Rivera gestured toward a small cafe across the street. Can I buy you lunch? I think you'll want to hear what I've discovered. Against her better judgment, Sarah found herself sitting across from Detective Rivera in a quiet corner booth, picking at a sandwich she didn't want while Rivera spread documents across the table. TechFlow Solutions has been moving money through shell companies for 18 months, Rivera began. Cryptocurrency transfers, offshore accounts, funds that disappear and reappear under different names. Sarah stared at the financial records. That's Jake's company. Jake's and Alexandra Reed's company, Rivera corrected. She's not just a business partner. Sarah, she's the mastermind behind this operation. What kind of operation? Rivera pulled out a series of photographs, surveillance shots of Jake and Alex entering buildings, meeting with people Sarah didn't recognize, sitting in expensive restaurants while reviewing documents. Identity theft, financial fraud, marriage fraud. Rivera listed. Alex has done this before, 3 times that we know of. She finds wealthy, isolated women, usually through a charming male partner. They marry the target, gain access to family money, then systematically drain the assets before disappearing. Sarah's sandwich turned to ash in her mouth. 3 times. The first was a widow in California, lost $2 million before she figured out what was happening. The second was a tech heiress in Seattle. Similar pattern, but she got suspicious too early. They had to abandon that con. And the third, Rivera's expression darkened. Jennifer Walsh in Chicago. She didn't figure it out until too late. What happened to her? Suicide, Rivera said quietly. Or that's what the death certificate says. Jennifer left behind a note saying she couldn't live with the shame of being so completely fooled. Sarah's hand went instinctively to her belly. The baby kicked, as if sensing her distress. Sarah, I think you're number 4. Rivera leaned forward. But you're also our best chance to stop them. How? Help me get evidence. Wear a wire. Get Jake to admit to the fraud. We need recorded confessions to make the charges stick. For the first time in days, Sarah felt hope stirring. You can arrest them with your help. Yes. Rivera pulled out a small recording device. This is voice-activated, completely undetectable. Get Jake talking about the offshore accounts, about the plan to control your inheritance. Sarah picked up the device, surprised by how light it was. When? Tonight. I'll be monitoring from a van outside your building, the moment you're in danger. We move in. Sarah thought about Jake's cold eyes, about Alex's satisfied smile, about Dr. Hayes's fake concern. These people had systematically dismantled her life, and now she had a chance to fight back. What do I need to do? Rivera spent the next hour coaching Sarah on how to guide conversations, how to get Jake to reveal incriminating details without seeming suspicious. They practiced questions, discussed scenarios, planned for contingencies. Remember, Rivera said as they prepared to leave the cafe, your safety is the priority. If Jake becomes violent or threatening, use the panic word we discussed. I'll be listening to everything. Sarah nodded, adrenaline replacing the exhaustion that had plagued her for weeks. Finally, she wasn't just reacting to their schemes, she was taking action. That evening, she returned to the penthouse for the first time since discovering Jake and Alex burning documents. Jake was waiting for her in the living room, his expression unreadable. Sarah, Alex said you ran out of your doctor's appointment today. I needed some air. Sarah sat down carefully, conscious of the recording device taped to her ribs. Jake, we need to talk about what's happening between us. What's happening is that you're having difficulty accepting help, Jake said. Dr. Hayes is concerned about your mental state. My mental state is fine. What I'm having difficulty accepting is being treated like a child. Sarah kept her voice calm, reasonable. The financial restrictions, the medical supervision, it feels like you don't trust me. Jake's expression softened slightly, and for a moment Sarah saw a flash of the charm that had initially attracted her. Sarah, I'm trying to protect you. Protect our family. Our family. Sarah leaned forward. Jake, help me understand something. If this is about protection, why are you and Alex working together on my finances? Why does she need access to my accounts? Alex has a background in financial management, Jake said smoothly. She's helping me organize our assets for the baby's future. What assets? The offshore accounts. Jake went very still. What offshore accounts? Sarah's heart pounded, but she pressed on. The ones you and Alex were discussing the other night. The cryptocurrency transfers. The shell companies. Sarah, I think your pregnancy is affecting your memory. My memory is fine. Sarah's voice sharpened. I saw the documents you were burning. I heard Alex talking about clean accounts, about medical documentation, about phase 2 of some plan. Jake stood up, his mask of concern slipping. You're imagining things. Am I imagining Alex wearing my clothes, sleeping in my bed, making medical decisions for me? Sarah stood too, facing him across the coffee table. What's phase 2? Jake, for a long moment, they stared at each other in silence. Then Jake smiled, not the warm smile she had fallen in love with, but something cold and predatory. Phase 2, he said quietly, is you disappearing entirely. The recording device felt suddenly heavy against her ribs. But before Sarah could respond, before she could give Rivera the panic signal, the front door opened and Alex walked in. Hello, Sarah, Alex said, closing the door behind her. We've been waiting for you to come home. In Alex's hand was a syringe. Sarah tried to run, but Jake caught her arm before she could take 2 steps. The recording device pressed against her ribs as he yanked her back toward the couch, and she prayed Detective Rivera was still listening. "Let me go." Sarah struggled against Jake's grip. "Help someone help me." Alex laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Scream all you want. Mrs. Patterson next door thinks you've been having psychotic episodes for weeks. She won't call the police. She'll call Dr. Hayes." "What's in the syringe?" Sarah demanded, trying to keep her voice steady for the recording. "Just a mild sedative," Alex said conversationally. "To help with your anxiety attack." "I'm not having an anxiety attack." "You will be," Jake said grimly. "When the paramedics find you unconscious on the bathroom floor, you'll have suffered a severe psychological break. Dr. Hayes will recommend immediate psychiatric hospitalization for the safety of you and the baby." Sarah felt the baby kick frantically, as if it too sensed the danger. "You can't do this. People will ask questions." "What people?" Alex moved closer, the syringe gleaming in the lamplight. "Your father disowned you years ago. You have no friends. We made sure of that. No job, no independent income, no support system." "Detective Rivera knows about you," Sarah said desperately. "She knows about the financial fraud, about your other victims. Jennifer Walsh in Chicago, she knows you killed her." Alex's expression flickered with surprise, then hardened into something terrifying. "Detective Rivera won't be a problem much longer." "What do you mean?" Jake's grip tightened on her arm. "Rivera's been feeding us information about the investigation from the beginning. Did you really think a cop would care about some rich woman's financial problems?" The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Detective Rivera, her last hope, her ally. Another betrayal, another lie. "The recording device she gave you this afternoon." Alex held up a small electronic device identical to the one taped to Sarah's ribs. "It's not transmitting to police surveillance. It's transmitting to us." Sarah's legs gave out. Jake caught her as she collapsed, his arms the only thing keeping her upright as her world finally crumbled completely. "We heard every word of your conversation at the cafe," Alex continued. "We know exactly what she told you about our previous arrangements. We know you agreed to help gather evidence against us." "You're criminals," Sarah whispered. "Both of you." "We're entrepreneurs," Jake corrected. "You're a product, Sarah. A very valuable product that's about to become too much trouble to maintain." Alex knelt beside them, the syringe ready. "This will be quick. When you wake up, you'll be in Hillcrest Psychiatric Hospital. Dr. Hayes has already completed the commitment paperwork. Severe postpartum psychosis. Danger to self and others." "I'm not postpartum. I haven't given birth." "You will have," Alex said gently. "Emergency C-section tonight. Premature labor brought on by psychological trauma. The baby will go to a loving father, and you'll receive the long-term care you so desperately need." Sarah stared at her in horror. "You're going to steal my baby." "We're going to save your baby," Jake said. "From a mentally unstable mother who poses a clear danger." Sarah felt the needle prick her arm, felt the burning sensation as whatever they were injecting spread through her bloodstream. Her vision began to blur at the edges. "The trust fund," she mumbled, fighting to stay conscious. "You won't be able to access it." "We won't need to," Alex said. "Jake will be a widowed single father with a newborn baby and enormous medical bills from his wife's psychiatric treatment. Your father will pay anything to help his grandchild. And when the baby's older," Sarah's tongue felt thick, uncooperative. "Tragic custody battle," Jake said sadly. "Institutionalized mother tries to kidnap her own child, forced to give up parental rights for everyone's safety." Sarah tried to speak, tried to fight, but the drug was pulling her under. Her last conscious thought was of her baby, still kicking weakly inside her as consciousness faded. She woke up in a small, white room with bars on the windows and a lock on the outside of the door. Her hospital gown was loose around her middle, and for a terrifying moment she couldn't feel the baby moving. Then a small kick against her ribs, and she nearly cried with relief. Still pregnant. Still time. A nurse entered, her expression professionally kind but distant. "Mrs. Collins, you're awake. How are you feeling?" "Where am I?" "Hillcrest Psychiatric Hospital. You had a severe psychotic episode at home. Your husband was very concerned." Sarah tried to sit up, but restraints held her to the bed. "I want to call my lawyer." "Mrs. Collins, you're not legally competent to make those decisions. Your husband has medical power of attorney." "Then I want to call my father." The nurse's expression didn't change. "Your father declined to take your calls. He said the family had disowned you years ago." Another lie. Sarah realized. They had isolated her completely. No friends, no family, no legal representation, no one who would question her disappearance into the mental health system. "How long have I been here?" 3 days. You've been heavily sedated for your own safety." 3 days. Sarah closed her eyes, feeling despair wash over her. By now, Jake and Alex would have had time to solidify their story, to present themselves as the concerned husband and friend dealing with a tragic situation. "I want to see Dr. Hayes." "Dr. Hayes is no longer your physician," the nurse said. "Dr. Brennan is handling your care now." Of course, even Dr. Hayes, complicit as he was, might have had limits to how far he would go. But a new doctor, one who only knew the official story, would have no such qualms. Sarah stared at the ceiling after the nurse left, feeling the baby's movements slow and sluggish inside her. Whatever they were giving her was affecting the pregnancy too. She had to find a way out, not just for herself, but for her child. But first, she had to find an ally. Sarah's ally came in the most unexpected form, a tiny woman in her 70s who shuffled into the common room wearing mismatched slippers and a hospital gown covered in flowers. At first glance, Maria Santos looked like any other psychiatric patient, muttering to herself as she worked on a jigsaw puzzle in the corner. But Sarah noticed something the staff missed. Maria's muttering followed logical patterns, and her fingers moved with the precision of someone accustomed to detailed work. "You're the oil heiress," Maria said quietly when Sarah sat down across from her at the puzzle table. "The one whose husband had her committed for trying to steal from the family trust?" "That's not what happened," Sarah said automatically. "I know." Maria fitted a puzzle piece into place with surgical precision. "Just like I know that guard thinks I'm senile because I can't remember what I had for breakfast. Memory problems are very convenient when you want people to underestimate you." Sarah studied the older woman more carefully. "Who are you?" "Maria Santos, former forensic accountant for the FBI. 25 years tracking financial crimes before I retired." Maria's eyes were sharp, intelligent. "My husband had me committed 6 months ago when I discovered he was laundering money through our consulting firm." "Your husband, federal judge, very respected, very connected." Maria selected another puzzle piece. Hard to convince anyone that such an upstanding man would gaslight his wife into a psychiatric facility to cover up his crimes. Sarah felt a spark of recognition. "You're not crazy either." "Crazy like a fox," Maria agreed. "But they don't know that. I've been using their underestimation to gather information, document the illegal commitments, build a case." "Against your husband?" "Against the whole system." Maria gestured around the common room. "Half the women in here aren't mentally ill. Sarah, we're inconvenient. We asked too many questions, threatened the wrong people, or simply existed in the way of someone else's plans. Sarah looked around the room with new eyes. The woman by the window who rocked constantly while staring outside, was she really catatonic, or was she traumatized by betrayal? The young woman who rarely spoke, was she mute from illness, or from the shock of discovering her reality was built on lies? How many? Sarah whispered. In this facility, maybe a dozen. Across the country, Maria shrugged. Thousands. It's easier than divorce, cleaner than murder, and perfectly legal if you have the right connections. Can you help me get out? Maria smiled for the first time since Sarah had met her. I was hoping you'd ask that. Your case is exactly what I need to blow this whole thing open. How? Your father is William Mitchell. Your husband's fraud involves cryptocurrency and shell companies. Your commitment was fast-tracked through a judge who's been taking kickbacks from private psychiatric facilities. Maria leaned forward. You're not just another inconvenient wife, Sarah. You're a scandal waiting to happen. Over the next several days, Maria taught Sarah how to navigate the system, how to appear compliant while gathering information, how to identify which staff members could be trusted and which were part of the network that facilitated illegal commitments, how to document everything without being caught. The key, Maria explained as they worked on puzzles in the common room, is making them think they've won. Let them believe you're accepting treatment, that you're grateful for their help. Sarah practiced the performance, playing the role of a woman coming to terms with her mental illness. She thanked Dr. Brennan for his care. She participated in group therapy. She took her medications without complaint, though Maria had taught her how to palm the pills and dispose of them later. All the while, she was documenting everything. The names of staff members who administered unauthorized medications, the visitors who came to evaluate patients for family members who wanted to extend commitments, the financial records Maria had helped her access through the hospital's computer system during a scheduled recreation period. Your husband's been busy, Maria reported after one of their covert computer sessions. He's liquidated most of your joint assets, transferred the cryptocurrency to accounts in Alex's name, and filed paperwork to have you declared permanently incompetent. What about the baby? Maria's expression darkened. He's been meeting with adoption attorneys. Private arrangements, very expensive, very discreet. Sarah's hand went to her belly, where the baby was finally moving normally again now that she was disposing of the psychiatric medications. He's going to sell my child. Not if we stop him first. Maria pulled out a small device Sarah hadn't seen before, a real recording device, military grade. I've been documenting everything since I got here. Guards taking bribes, doctors falsifying diagnoses, administrators covering up suspicious deaths. Suspicious deaths. Jennifer Walsh wasn't the only one who supposedly committed suicide after being destroyed by Alex and Jake's cons. Maria's voice was grim, but I don't think any of them actually killed themselves. Sarah felt cold despite the hospital's oppressive heat. You think they were murdered. I think inconvenient witnesses have a way of dying tragically in psychiatric facilities, Maria said. Car accidents during supervised outings, medication overdoses, falls downstairs during alleged psychotic episodes. We have to get out of here. We will. But first, we're going to make sure they can never do this to anyone else again. Maria smiled grimly. I've been building this case for 6 months. You're the final piece I need. What do you mean? Your father may have betrayed you, but he's still a Mitchell. When this story breaks, oil heiress imprisoned by fraudulent husband while father profits from the scheme, it won't just destroy Jake and Alex. It'll bring down the entire network. Sarah stared at the puzzle they'd been working on, finally seeing the complete picture emerging from hundreds of individual pieces. When do we go public? Tomorrow, Maria said. I've already contacted 3 journalists and a federal prosecutor. The story breaks on the morning news. Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope mixed with anticipation instead of hope mixed with fear. But as she prepared for sleep that night, she couldn't shake the feeling that Jake and Alex wouldn't go down without a fight. And in a psychiatric facility where accidents happened regularly and questions were rarely asked, she and Maria were extremely vulnerable. She was right to be worried. The fire alarm started screaming at 3 a.m. Sarah jerked awake in her narrow hospital bed, immediately alert despite the late hour. She had learned not to sleep deeply in this place, where midnight medical emergencies sometimes meant patients who asked too many questions were transferred to more secure facilities. Emergency lights flashed red in the hallway, and she could hear staff shouting instructions, doors slamming, the sound of multiple people running. But something felt wrong about the chaos. Too organized, too purposeful. She slipped out of bed and pressed her ear to her door. No smoke smell, no heat from the hallway. The fire alarm was real, but the fire wasn't. A distraction. Sarah's blood turned to ice as she realized what was happening. Maria had said the story would break on the morning news. Someone had found out. She tried her door handle and was surprised to find it unlocked, another sign that this wasn't a real emergency. During genuine crises, psychiatric patients were locked in their rooms for safety. The hallway was empty except for emergency lighting. Sarah could hear staff evacuating patients from the far wing, but her section seemed to have been forgotten in the chaos, or deliberately abandoned. She found Maria's room 3 doors down, also unlocked, also empty. But on the floor beside Maria's bed was a small pool of blood and scuff marks suggesting a struggle. They had taken her. Sarah's training with Detective Rivera kicked in despite the betrayal. Look for evidence. Document everything. Find a way to communicate with the outside world. She grabbed Maria's hidden recording device from its hiding place inside the puzzle box, then headed for the staff office she and Maria had identified as the facility's communication center. The office was empty. Its computer still logged into the hospital's admin system. Sarah's fingers flew over the keyboard, accessing patient records, staff schedules, financial databases. She copied everything onto Maria's device. Proof of illegal commitments, falsified medical records, suspicious patient deaths, and most damning of all, the financial trail showing payments from Jake's shell companies to hospital administrators. But as she worked, she could hear voices in the corridor. Not staff voices, but Jake's familiar tone and Alex's distinctive laugh. They were here, inside the facility, coming for her. Sarah looked around the office desperately, then noticed something she had missed before. A window that faced not the secured courtyard, but the public street, and below that window, a fire escape. She grabbed the office phone and dialed 911. "This is Sarah Mitchell calling from Hillcrest Psychiatric Hospital," she said quickly when the operator answered. "I'm being held here illegally, and they're trying to kill me. My father is William Mitchell of Mitchell Oil. Send police immediately. And notify the media." She hung up before the operator could respond, knowing they would trace the call, but hoping it would take precious minutes they didn't have. The voices in the corridor were getting closer. Sarah climbed onto the desk and forced open the window, grateful for the months of yoga classes that had kept her flexible despite her pregnancy. The fire escape was rusty and narrow, but it held her weight as she climbed down into the alley behind the hospital. Above her, she could hear shouting from the office she had just vacated, but she wasn't running this time. She was going on the offensive. Sarah made her way to the front of the building, where ambulances and fire trucks were parked for the false alarm. News vans were already arriving. Word of her 911 call had spread quickly through the media networks that monitored police scanners for breaking stories. She walked directly toward the largest news van, her hospital gown and obvious pregnancy making her impossible to ignore. "I'm Sarah Mitchell," she announced to the reporter who jumped out to meet her. "My husband had me committed to steal my inheritance, and they just tried to kill me to cover it up." The reporter's eyes widened as she recognized the name, the story, the scoop of a lifetime happening right in front of her camera. "Are you saying you've been held against your will?" "I'm saying my husband Jake Collins and his partner Alexandra Reed are con artists who have done this before to other women. I have evidence of their financial fraud, and evidence that this facility has been illegally committing women whose only crime was threatening powerful men's interests." Sarah held up Maria's recording device. "Everything is documented: financial records, falsified medical reports, suspicious deaths. This story is bigger than just my case." More news crews were arriving, drawn by police scanners and social media reports. Sarah found herself surrounded by cameras and microphones, finally able to tell her story to the world. "Where is Maria Santos?" she demanded, looking directly into the main camera. "She's a federal accountant who was documenting illegal activities at this facility. An hour ago, she was in her room. Now she's missing, and there's blood on her floor." Behind the crowd of reporters, Sarah could see Jake and Alex through the hospital's front windows, arguing with staff, realizing their plan had completely unraveled. "Mrs. Mitchell," another reporter called out, "what do you want people to know?" Sarah looked directly into the camera, thinking of Jennifer Walsh, of Maria Santos, of all the women who had been silenced by systems designed to protect powerful men from inconvenient truths. "I want people to know that this can happen to anyone," she said clearly. "If you have assets someone wants, if you threaten someone's power, if you simply exist in the way of someone else's plans, you can disappear into the mental health system and no one will question it. But not anymore. Not after tonight." Police cars were arriving now, their sirens adding to the chaos. But Sarah wasn't afraid of the noise anymore. For the first time in months, chaos was working in her favor. As Detective Rivera's patrol car pulled up, the real Detective Rivera, Sarah hoped. She felt her baby kick strongly inside her. They had survived, both of them. And now it was time for justice. 6 months later, Sarah stood before the Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on Oversight, Federal Rights, and Agency Action. Her 3-month-old daughter sleeping peacefully in a carrier at her feet. The hearing room was packed with journalists, advocacy groups, and families of other women who had experienced similar betrayals. "Senator Williams," Sarah addressed the committee chair, her voice clear and confident. "What happened to me was not an isolated incident. Our investigation has uncovered a network of corrupt medical professionals, legal officials, and financial institutions that systematically target women for economic exploitation." She gestured to the thick stack of evidence on the table before her: Maria Santos's meticulous documentation, financial records seized from Jake's accounts, testimonies from dozens of women who had been illegally committed or financially defrauded. Maria Santos, the forensic accountant whose work made this investigation possible, was murdered at Hillcrest Psychiatric Hospital while trying to expose this network. Her death was staged to look like suicide, but forensic evidence proved she was killed to silence her testimony. The committee members leaned forward, their expressions grave. This case had dominated headlines for months, becoming a symbol of how the intersection of mental health policy and family law could be weaponized against vulnerable women. "Mrs. Mitchell," Senator Williams said, "can you tell us what happened to your husband and his co-conspirator?" Sarah allowed herself a small smile. Jake Collins was convicted of fraud, conspiracy, unlawful imprisonment, and accessory to murder. He received 25 years in federal prison. Alexandra Reed was convicted of similar charges and received 30 years, as she was identified as the primary architect of the scheme that victimized at least 7 women over 5 years. And the medical professionals involved, Dr. Marcus Hayes lost his medical license and was convicted of practicing medicine fraudulently. He received 8 years. Dr. Brennan at Hillcrest was convicted of falsifying psychiatric evaluations and received 12 years. The hospital administrator who accepted payments to facilitate illegal commitments received 15 years. Sarah paused, looking down at her daughter. But convictions aren't enough. We need systematic reform to prevent this from happening to other women. What reforms are you proposing? Sarah stood, her posture confident despite the weight of everything she had endured. First, mandatory second opinions for all involuntary psychiatric commitments, with at least one evaluation conducted by a state employee with no financial connection to private facilities. The audience murmured approval. This had been one of the key recommendations from the investigative commission Sarah had helped establish. Second, automatic legal representation for anyone facing competency hearings, funded by the state to eliminate conflicts of interest. Third, mandatory reporting of suspicious patient deaths in psychiatric facilities, with investigations conducted by independent agencies rather than facility staff. And fourth, criminal penalties for medical professionals who participate in fraudulent commitments, including mandatory life sentences for anyone whose actions result in patient deaths. Senator Williams nodded. These are comprehensive recommendations. Mrs. Mitchell, do you believe they would have prevented your situation? I believe they would have saved Maria Santos's life, Sarah said simply, and Jennifer Walsh's life, and Patricia Hoffman's life, and the lives of other women who supposedly committed suicide after being systematically destroyed by this network. Sarah looked directly into the C-SPAN camera that was broadcasting the hearing live. But I also want to address the women who might be watching this right now. Women who recognize their own experiences in my story. Her voice softened but remained strong. You are not crazy. You are not incompetent. You are not alone. If someone is using your mental health, your pregnancy, your family relationships as weapons against you, that is abuse, and it is illegal. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a card. The Sarah Mitchell Foundation for Financial Justice now operates a 24-hour helpline for women experiencing economic abuse. We provide legal representation, safe housing, and financial support for women escaping situations like mine. The baby stirred in her carrier, making soft cooing sounds. Sarah reached down and gently stroked her daughter's cheek. I named her Maria, Sarah said to the committee, after Maria Santos, who gave her life to expose the truth. Maria Santos saved my daughter and me. And through this foundation, she's continuing to save other women. Senator Williams smiled. Mrs. Mitchell, in your written testimony, you mentioned that your relationship with your father has been completely severed. Can you explain that decision? Sarah's expression hardened slightly. William Mitchell knew about Jake's background and funded his company specifically to control me through marriage. When the FBI investigation revealed the extent of his involvement in orchestrating my situation, I made the choice to permanently cut all ties with him and Mitchell Oil and Gas. That must have been financially difficult. It was liberating, Sarah said firmly. I built my own consulting firm specializing in financial fraud investigation. The skills I learned from surviving this experience have made me very good at helping other people protect their assets from similar schemes. And you're engaged to be married again? Sarah glanced toward the audience. where a tall man with kind eyes was holding a little boy who looked to be about 4 years old. Detective Michael Rivera, Maria's brother, and I are getting married next month. He's a civil rights attorney now. And together, we're continuing Maria's work on a national level. She looked back at the committee. But I want to be very clear about something. I didn't need rescuing by a good man. I rescued myself. Michael and I are partners, equals. That's the only kind of relationship I'll ever accept again. The hearing continued for another hour, covering technical aspects of the proposed legislation and implementation timelines. But for Sarah, the most important moment had already passed. The moment when she looked into that camera and spoke directly to women who might be living in the same nightmare she had escaped. After the hearing, as she walked down the Capitol steps with baby Maria in her arms, reporters shouted questions about her future plans, her foundation's work, her upcoming marriage. "Mrs. Mitchell," one reporter called out, "what do you want your legacy to be?" Sarah paused on the steps, looking out at the crowd of journalists and advocates who had supported her fight for justice. "I want women to know that their stories matter," she said. "I want them to know that someone who tries to destroy you doesn't get to define you. And I want them to know that fighting back is always possible, even when it seems impossible." She shifted baby Maria to her other arm, the infant's bright eyes taking in the chaos of cameras and voices. "Most of all, I want them to know that surviving isn't enough. Thriving is the real victory." As Sarah walked toward the car where Michael was waiting, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The naive woman who had believed in fairy tale marriages was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood that real love was built on truth, respect, and equality. Behind her, the Capitol dome gleamed in the afternoon sun, a symbol of the justice she had fought to achieve. Ahead of her lay a future built on her own terms, surrounded by people who had earned her trust through their actions rather than their promises. For the first time in her adult life, Sarah Mitchell was exactly where she was supposed to be.